In Watson's reading as İNGİLİZ, the national tale is, insofar as it is a genre of national cohesion, deals with a nation, defined in general terms, as a synonym for polity, even society, and in a context understood as homogeneously British. For Tracy, it exists within the context of a romantic nationalism that views Ireland as separate and unique. Both readings depend on an understanding of the national tale as an essentially insular genre, derived either from a Britain so uniform in its dedication to union that writers from Ireland and Scotland cooperate in narrative opposition to disruptions they associate with French revolutionary influence, or from an Ireland already post-colonial in its narrative self-definitions. In contrast, are readings by, for example, Corbett's Eagleton, Lilith, and Dean, who argued that the shifting of authority between narrators is more significant than any final accommodation that is reached. Eagleton and Corbett suggest that the textual encounter between the editor and Teddy constitutes an attempt to find a middle ground between the editor's narrative and political objectivity, which might border on colonnus, and sympathy with Teddy and the other recurrent tenants, which risks being blinded by closeness to those whom it describes. For Corbett, this middle way is gendered, grounded in a critique of Anglo-Irish landowners and of their tenants as bad husbands and bad fathers, though Corbett points out that the novel neglects to acknowledge the dysfunctional context, the imperfect evolution of native landholding and kinship traditions, and the incomplete adoption of British ones, in which both kinds of behavior flourish. For Lloyd and Dean, on the other hand, a failure to impose narrative order is apparent in the competition between Teddy and the narrators, and is evidence of what Lloyd calls a crisis of representation, caused by the unease of a genre whose key aim is to impose order on what it understands as chaos, as noise rather than conversation, while downplaying the historical factors that have created it. For all these readers, the national tale exists on the uncertain terrain of negotiation between Ireland and Britain, both of which in turn are internally fractured according to politics, culture, and class. In short, the national tale divides its readers because novel and genre are alike divided by contending views and voices. Narrative divisions and divisions between readers are symptoms of transnational encounter. Now we come to the work Castle Recurrent. I give you to read this novel especially. Now I will follow and go further the other part. The national tale and metropolitan genres. The unceasing movement of Castle Recurrent from perspective to perspective among competing narrators, voices, and documents is inherited from the historical tale of 1790s. Itself, it should be noted, a genre that remains minor within the history of the novel as well as within the 19th century literary canon, despite its contemporary popularity. As such, it is closer to a mix of characteristics from the liberal tales of the times and exotic tales than it is to conservative didactic fiction. It is precisely such a repudiation of a stable genre center of narrative judgment and national definition that recurs in subsequent national tales, making Edgeworth's novel at once prophetic and typical. Among the best examples is Owenson's eser adını vermiş, the first volume of which is entirely taken up by the lengthy conversations of two new arrivals in Ireland. One, a brave guerrilla chief whose life and fortune have been devoted to South American independence, is by birth the lost heir to the Norman Irish Marquis of Dunor. The other is apparently English, a romantic and reader of picturesque tours, but in reality is son and heir to the Anglo-Irish usurper of the Dunor estate. Traveling incognito, the pair debate about women taste the best way to live, the character of America, and especially the political economy of Ireland, without interruption or resolution. A similar series of conversations presented in epistolary form without an authoritative editor takes place in eser adını vermiş. Mathurin's text is not, as has sometimes been suggested, a parody, eser adını gene vermiş. It is closer to but precedes Edgeworth's Envy in recounting the history of an Anglo-Irish heir who has bored himself with too much pleasure, though Mathurin's Ormsby battle, unlike Edgeworth's Earl of Glenthorne, is away from the start of the harm he is causing himself and his estate. The novel's events, unlike Owenson's, take place almost entirely in urban social settings, in London as well as in Dublin and in rural Ireland. Nevertheless, it imitates Owenson's frameless epistolary form. Further examples include two important novels by the middle-class Catholic Irish novelist John Bannon. Eser adı verilmiş, whose paired heroes present heartfelt opposing perspectives on the Williamite Wars, Savaş 1689-90. Burada gene eser adını vermiş. Biraz daha aşağılara geçiyorum. With an opening volume devoted to a clash of religious, political and moral opinions on post-Union Ireland, arriving at neither reconciliation or consensus. In each of these novels, the visible sharing of narrative authority underscores a similar theme, the lack of a single uniform ethnical and political standpoint. The impossibility of consensus characterizes the nation whose tale is being told. I have suggested that the national tales descend from the historical tales and tales of the times of the 1790s is one reason for its inclusion of diverse voices, texts, and genres. The most detailed and complex accounts of the national tale as a distinctive genre by Trumpeter and Ferris go a long way to explain why these predecessors forms of fiction should have attracted the writers of national tales. The Trumpeter begins her account with a history of literary representations of Ireland by metropolitan writers. She demonstrates that Ireland and the Scottish Highlands were perceived in Romantic period England as at once exotic and familiar, dikkat edin buralara, part of the national family of Britain and yet insufficiently well known to be fully and safely assimilated. It was in writing that Englishmen sought to domesticate the differences in tours and surveys such as Young's eser adı verilmiş, which presented the land, people and languages of the Highlands and Ireland as a romantic spectacle and at the same time as a wasteland to be reclaimed and modernized. As Susan Stewart might put it, they distressed the peripheries, not only in the sense of Highland clearances and prejudicial Irish trade laws, but also in the sense of antiquating them, treating Ireland and the Highlands as surviving pockets of a pre-modern past that England has long since left. In short, these texts acted as a cultural counterpart to Union. For this reason, Trumpener argues the earliest national tales were created in creation against them. Irish and Scottish writers drew on historical tales to respond with a pastiche of conventions and quotations imitated from metropolitan genres, such as landscape description and antiquarian research. At the same time, they reinserted the stories of historical change that had left their traces on peripheral landscapes, literatures, and histories. As with the tales of the times, the very form of their novels promoted the idea of a public sphere. Here, periphery and metropole would debate their relations on literary terms, at least of equality. Irish national tales in particular insisted on the complex, ancient and continuing history of Ireland and its inhabitants, while documenting the fractures caused by transnational conflict and metropolitan control. In this way, Trumpener argues Irish novelists made their own descriptions of Irish speech, dikkat edin, and landscape into vehicles for the self-definition of the inhabitants of Ireland as a distinct people within Britain, and thus, in some cases, for the self-assertion of the smaller nation against the larger. Ironically, however, the national tale didn't remain a genre of anti-colonial protest or small nation self-assertion. In Ireland, as it faded into the gentler regional novels of a Lever or Griffin, the representation of sublime landscapes and pheasant speech was taken up by metropolitan sojourners like Anthony Trollope, eser adında vermiş, which transmutes the national tale's theme of dispossessed narrative Irish aristocracy into a purely comic register, were popular in England. Moreover, because of the origins in such acts of transnational self-definition, the national tale is uniquely fitted, once exported to the colonies of the 19th century, to provide a model for new self-definitions as the colonies began to define themselves and eventually came to be recognized as nations. Though the differences between them are real, they are not instinct. There is no absolute distinction between the native and the settler, the original and imitation. Rather, the divergence is a product of specific transnational histories. Edgeworth's Enu, John Benham's eser adı verilmiş, are especially fine examples of the simultaneous imitation and criticism with which the national tale responded to metropolitan genres. In Enu, the aristocratic English tourist Craig Thorpe comes to Ireland to collect materials for a tour through Ireland or a view of Ireland, or something of that nature, a book to resemble Arthur Young's. He is fed absurd anecdotes, incredible facts, stale jests, and blunders such as were never made by true-born Irishmen by the witty Lady Geraldine, who plans to show him what a farrago of nonsense he has collected as materials for his quarto diye eser böyle gidiyor. The implication is that Young might have benefited from similar lessons and a similar circumspection, but Edgeworth's novel refuses to validate either the metropolitan or the nationalist claim of Irish exceptionalism for, as well as being an Englishman. Crellington Thorpe is cousin of the patriotic Lady Geraldine. His cousin's name simultaneously associates her with the United Irishman, Lord Edward Fitzgerald. Evet, burada böyle eser bu şekilde gidiyor. Anlatımları filan da var. Bunlara da bir bakarsınız. Eserin uzunluğu epey var. Sizlerle gelecek hafta marriage and multiplicity konusunu işlemeye çalışalım. Bu arada tabii ödevlerinizi de değerlendirdim kardeşlerim. Onlara da bakarsınız. Diğer vize için vermiş olduğum ödevleri de lütfen zamanında gönderin bana. Sizlere iyi bir hafta sonu diliyorum. Kendinize Dikkat ediniz. Sokağa fazla çıkmamaya çalışınız. Gelecek hafta tekrar görüşmek üzere. Hoşça kalın diyorum sizlere.